This is Root Source, and now let's get back to author Doug Hamp on the question of whether Jesus spoke Aramaic or Hebrew.
Right.
So again, it just doesn't make sense. If it had been Aramaic, he would have said Elai, Elai, but he didn't.
Right.
He said Eloi.
Well,
right?
so you've talked about Eloi, and you've talked about Lama. What about that last word, sabachthani?
Yeah, the word shaktani is an interesting word. I mean, first of all, assuming that Jesus was taking this directly from Psalm 22, and just for the record, I think that what Mark recorded were the actual words of Jesus, whereas I think Matthew was recording the idea, but not the actual utterance itself. So, Matthew probably, was thinking, well, wait a second, this is hard to say in Greek. I'll just say Eli, Eli, because that's what it's actually in the Bible. The word shaktani, it's really interesting. Okay, so now this does appear to be a word of Aramaic origin, and it means to leave alone, entrust, bequeath, divorce, forsake. Now, it's interesting that it is actually used a total of 5 times in the Hebrew Bible. They're all found in Aramaic portions of Daniel and Ezra. There was a limited amount of Aramaic influence that was exerted on the Hebrew language. So when we do find the word Shabbat in the Jewish writings such as the Jerusalem Talmud, which is where the Mishnah actually comes from. And we find the word Shabbat 7 times in the Mishnah. 4 are clearly couched in Hebrew prose, and a passage from the Jerusalem Talmud, which is 31 verse 5, section 1, is an especially good example of where you have these words that are surrounding, they're Hebrew words, surrounding the word Shabbat. So what I'm suggesting is that you have this word that's come into the Hebrew language as a loan word, just like we have lots of loan words in English from French and other places, and the French, they have les jogging, for jogging, right? That's obviously not a French word, but they've made it French, and we have lots of words as well, such as pork and beef. These are not actually English words. They've come from French, but now they've made their way into English, and we don't even think about it. What I would see here is that the word shabaktani may have originally come from Aramaic, but it was completely assimilated into Mishnaic Hebrew, as attested in the writings of the Mishnah, and that pointed out in the final stage of ancient Hebrew before its demise around 200. So, I was going to say that the ta plus ni, shabaktani, that's exactly what we would expect in biblical Hebrew. So in other words, you forsook me, right? Yeah.
So just because a word is co-opted by a language doesn't mean that you're speaking in that language.
Right.
If an American says shalom to someone, it doesn't mean they're speaking Hebrew. Okay.
Right. Or we say coup d'etat or pick me,
yes,
and the list goes on, right?
So are you saying that you've gone through every case of a word or a phrase in the New Testament that has been attributed to be Aramaic by scholars, and in every single case you have explained it completely in Hebrew?
Well, I think so. Yeah. As a scholar, you probably never get to the end of anything, right? But the first time you write it, you think you do. So, but yeah, I think that I've given a very good explanation of all the words. Let's take another one. Mark 7:34. We have the word ephata, okay, or ephatha, as they might say it in English. So again, this seems to be another proof of Aramaic replacing the Hebrew. Okay, this would be one of those. They're like, well, check out this word. That's not exactly Hebrew.
Ephrata.
He says,
is that?
Yeah, that. Ephata, no, not Ephrata, but Ephata. It says, then looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephata, that is, be opened.
Oh, gotcha.
Okay, yeah, so it's a very obscure little thing here. But, first of all, it's telling us that he wasn't speaking Greek, okay, because some people are suggesting that. And just for the listeners to know that, obviously I think Jesus could have spoken anything he wanted, right? But we're only arguing with what he actually did, okay? What he could have done, I don't know, he could have spoken Swahili, I suppose, but that's beside the point. So,
right. Yeah.
So what we have to do then is to understand, okay, what's happening with this word. And like this is a Semitic word, whether it's Hebrew or Aramaic, we have to just figure that out. But we have to, first of all, isolate the three root letters, and that's what we need to figure out.
Okay.
But all the research of, like all the people that had, I wouldn't say all, but many of the researchers that had come before me had concluded that it was Aramaic. Okay, so I had to, basically do my own research, and I had to then, because I couldn't go and just consult somebody, because there's nobody to consult, right? So I had to go back and look at this word here, ephata, and I'm like, oh my goodness, what does that mean, But I'm like, well, I think it's Hebrew, so let's take a look at it. I'm sure I can figure this out. And, I had to stare at it for probably an hour, and I'm like, oh, of course, I get it, And then it finally came to me. I'm like, be open. Well, of course, it's patach. But then I'm like, well, wait a second. How do you get fi, tav? How do you get, or whatever, from the Greek there, how do you get that into patach, And I'm like, okay, it makes sense because, again, the het, there's no way to actually say that letter in Greek. So, what is Mark going to do? And then I'm like, why do you have this double fee thing? That doesn't make any sense to me, right? So it did take me a little while to basically get in there and to figure it out. But once I figured it out, it's eureka. You're like, well, of course,
As I listened to what you've said about these words and about the large number of researchers that have said that the common language of Jesus was Aramaic, it just raises for me a question of motivation. What do you think is driving so many researchers to try to force Jesus into being an Aramaic speaker and not a Hebrew speaker?
Yeah. Well, first of all, for the record, I want to say that I think most people really don't have a horse in the race. They haven't thought of the issue, they haven't thought of the implications, and I think most people are just operating on ignorance in the best of ways, okay, that, they're not trying to, there's no conspiracy here, at least not on the average guy kind of level, okay. If there were a conspiracy, I think it'd be up in the spiritual level, okay, in the spiritual realm. But, as far as the average researcher, I think that they're like, well, yeah, he spoke Aramaic because that's what I read. That's what my professors told me, and that's what he told me. His professor told him, right? And we have to start having this tradition. I think it's important that we overcome this incorrect tradition because what it does very subtly is it establishes anti-Semitism at a very basic level, because what happens is now you're disconnecting Jesus, Yeshua, from his culture, from his language, from his people, right? You're saying, look, this guy that we think is, a somebody here, he's a the who's who of the Bible, and yet he spoke Aramaic. He didn't even know Hebrew, right? You're like, well, what kind of insights could he have had? Did he actually read the Torah? Did he actually understand it? This would be the thing where now you've got this Christian Jesus versus this Hebrew Yeshua, right? And I think that very, very subtly, and again, I don't think that any one person is out to, destroy Jesus in that sense, but I think, the combined ignorance on this point has and does lead to people basically divorcing Jesus from his Hebrew Israelite Jewish culture. What's important for me is that, Jesus and Moses could have talked, He and King David, they could have talked. He could have talked to anybody in Hebrew, right? No other language necessary. The language of the Torah, the prophets, the writings, that is his language. It's deep in his heart. And that's what he communicated to the disciples in. That's what he communicated to the people in, that he communicated that language with the Pharisees and the scribes and, everybody. They were all speaking Hebrew.
I think this is a critically important point, and I think your comment about a latent anti-Semitism or something, I think that there is a battle that goes on in the spiritual plane that attempts to divorce Jesus from his Hebrew roots as much as possible. So it's I agree with you. I think that's a fascinating point. And even for those that say that Jesus knew Hebrew, often Hebrew is relegated as, well, that was the religious language. The Levites and those that studied the Torah, they knew it. But common practice was Aramaic was spoken in the time of Jesus. Well, of course, Aramaic was spoken all around Babylon, and for much of that eastern world, Aramaic was a language of commerce. It was used, and I would suggest that many Jews in the time of Israel spoke Aramaic. But this idea that Hebrew was just a language for religious study, I don't see that in what you're talking about here. You have a comment?
Yeah, if you go to Israel today, you'll find that probably 80 to 90% of Israelis speak pretty good English, right? And, you could go there as an American tourist and say, well, gosh, I went there and everybody spoke English. I guess they don't speak Hebrew, right? Yes. I mean, that you could conclude that, right? Because everywhere you went, everyone was gracious enough to speak English with you. But the moment that you leave, they go back to speaking Hebrew with one another because that's their language. That's the language of their heart, right? And that's what's important to understand is that Hebrew never died out. It never died out. And that's a really weird one because, you start reading some of these papers by people, and they're like, well, after they came back from the Babylonian captivity, they had lost their ability to speak Hebrew. So you're like, well, okay, so then why did God send all these prophets, the late biblical Hebrew prophets, as it were, such as Zechariah, Malachi, Haggai, and they all spoke Hebrew. I mean, why is that? If Hebrew was such a dead language, and God actually cared about communicating to his people in a language they could understand, why is it in Hebrew and not Aramaic?
I think I think that's a wonderful point. And I've had a chance. I've read your book. I loved it, and it really opened my eyes. And I've thought about your book since, and there are three things that have come to my mind about those returning exiles from Babylon as to why Hebrew would have been spoken in Israel in time of Jesus. I'd like to throw these out at you and see if you have any comment, because we haven't talked about this. The first reason why I think, in addition to everything you wrote, that those returning exiles would have spoken Hebrew is that the Spirit, it says in Ezra, that the Spirit moved upon them to come back and restore the temple. So I see these people as being extremely zealous to not just come back, but to restart the practices around the temple. I was thinking, if the Hebrews revived Hebrew after 2,000 years, they could certainly have kept it going for 70. I mean, come on. Okay. The second reason I've thought about it, in addition to what you've written, is that there was such a strong motivation and desire for education. One of our teachers, Ken Spiro, has said that he believes that Israel was probably the first fully educated population. This is in the times of David and Solomon and beyond that. And so these parents, having had those traditions, would have been extremely zealous to teach that to their kids and to keep that language going, even as they do it today. And then my third suggestion, and you can comment about any of this, but my third suggestion is that at the end of the book of Ezra resisted the infiltration by the foreign wives, and all the people came along and agreed to do this massive thing, this very difficult separation from these foreign wives, and if they were willing to go to those lengths to try to keep their children from being influenced by outside forces. It seems to me, how much more would they go to take the rather trivial step of keeping Hebrew going in those years? So anyway, those are my ideas. Any thoughts?
Yeah. No, I think you're really onto something. I mean, Israel, it's hard to say how much the average farmer, could have read, but you do get this impression that, their education was better than the average, farmer back in the day, because, whether they could personally read. First of all, they had a writing system that was much easier than those surrounding them, such as cuneiform in Babylon, which is a real pain to read. I mean, here you have a very, pretty easy method to read, just 22 letters. I mean, it's about as easy as it gets, right? And then secondly, they were constantly discussing God's word. At least they were supposed to be, right? So, yeah, I think, again, it's hard for me to say, the average guy, how much he could actually do. But we do know that that education was stressed to some degree. And the other thing about, losing your language in basically one generation. I mean, look at the Chinese. They've come to America, and still some of them don't speak English, because they've been able to be secluded to some extent, not all of them, but some of them. They have, these Chinatowns in New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco, and you could actually live your whole life speaking Chinese and not learning English, right? So, you have to understand that the Jews were basically secluded north of Babylon. So they weren't all separated and, just doing kind of menial tasks every day. They were kept together, and they could then keep their culture, they could keep their language, and, they just didn't lose it. So.
Well, I think you're really onto something here with this idea. The book is not large. It doesn't take too long to go through it. I loved it. Where can people get a copy of it?
You can go to my website, douglashamp.com, and you go to my store. It's in there. Or you can just go directly to Amazon.
And this book was your first. You have some others, and you talk about those on your website. And you also are hosting a radio show. What is the general topic of that, and how do people listen in to you?
Yeah, it's called The Awakening Report. It's on my YouTube channel, so youtube.com/Doug Hamp. I've talked about one thing that I wrote in my third book called Corrupting the Image is the whole concept of genetics and how I believe that plays into the mark of the beast. So that's one thing that we talk about. End times kind of topics are also popular, but I've kind of kept it open just because I have a wide variety of things that I think are really fun to talk about. And there you can hear my thing every Tuesday night at 7 o'clock. And then I also have lots of other videos on my YouTube channel. And, of course, a lot of things on my website, douglashamp.com.
Doug, it's been great speaking with you today. Thank you so much for informing our listeners about this. I really do recommend this book, and we'll hope to meet again.
I hope so. Thank you for having me.